Hey everyone, in this video we're going to try to answer the question of how do we form the present tense passive voice. So before we dive in, we want to really understand what voice is in Latin. And there's two options. There's active and passive voice. So you might have heard these already, or maybe this is your first time hearing it, but it's a little tricky to understand exactly what we mean by this. And the reason why is in a lot of times in school, if you're writing in English, for instance, your teacher might have told you don't use the passive voice, right? And we try to kind of get it out of you at an early age, but it's really common. In Latin, and you can use it in English, and you probably should, right? And there's reasons you would use the active or passive voice. But if you're not sure what it means, this is the basic idea. If you're trying to understand active versus passive, think of it this way. If you live an active lifestyle, it means you're always doing stuff, right? You're up and at 'em, right? A passive lifestyle is when you're not really doing anything. You're just sitting at home, you're sitting on a couch, not really moving. That's kind of one way we use it in English. Here's some examples of, you said, I am walking the dog, right? That's different than saying the dog is being walked by me. And you might pause and say, well, wait a minute, Mr. C, don't these mean the same thing? Yeah, technically the meaning is pretty much the same, but the way we expressed it was different. And that's the difference between active and passive voice, right? So if you're thinking of hanging out with your dog, and you're walking it, if you write it and say, I'm walking the dog, you're really putting the emphasis on yourself, right? I'm the one walking the dog. If you say the dog is being walked, right? You're kind of putting the emphasis on the idea that the dog went for a walk, but you don't really care who did it. If you say the dog was walked by me, now you're kind of, still getting at the idea that you were the one walking your dog, but it's a different way of expressing the same thing, okay? And it really boils down to this. Active voice is when your verb is active, rather. It's when the subject is the one performing the action. So if you say, I'm walking the dog, my verb is walking, right? The direct object is the dog, and I'm the subject. I am actually walking. That's called an active voice verb, right? You can hear it in English. I am walking. Makes sense. Passive voice is when the subject isn't doing anything. It's receiving the action, right? So if you say the dog is being walked by me, the verb is being walked, right? So when you say the dog is being walked, the dog isn't doing anything, right? Something's happening to the dog. This is the passive voice, right? And it often goes with the ablative case, usually something we call the ablative of agent, which we'll talk about later on in the video. The by me part in English is telling you who's actually walking the dog, right? So why would you do this? Again, usually we use passive voice if you're trying to not necessarily hide, but de-emphasize who's actually doing the action. So maybe, maybe your mom or dad, someone says, go walk the dog, right? And they ask, did the dog get walked today, right? When you say, did the dog get walked or was the dog walked, it doesn't matter who did it. You just want to know whether or not the dog went for a walk, right? That's kind of the idea of when you would use passive voice. So you don't want to shy away from passive voice in English for sure, but in Latin, it's very common. So you really need to wrap your head around it. And hopefully it's starting to make some sense, right? Again, the key thing, active, you're doing something, passive, something's happening to you. That's really the difference between active and passive voice. So how do we do this in Latin? Right? It really depends on what tense you're using. And in this video, we're going to really look at or only look at the present tense because the process is slightly different depending on which one you use. Okay. But the general idea is kind of the same no matter what tense you're doing, but the way we get there is kind of unique and different. So for present tense passive voice, right, the process between forming the active voice and the passive voice is actually the same thing, right, which is good, or at least it starts the same way. Right. The difference, though, is in the endings we use. So the process is the same, right? The steps, the endings are different. And that's how you're going to differentiate between active and passive voice. So what are the passive voice endings, right? Well, instead of OST, must, sunt, which are active, for passive, we have R, RISTUR, MUR, MINI, and NTUR. And they represent I, you, he, she, it, we, you, all, they. Right? So if we do a comparison and look at active versus passive endings, it looks like this. The active ending for I is O. The passive equivalent is R. So if I have a verb ending in an O, it means I'm doing something. If it ends in an R, it means I am being something, right? It's just passive voice. So these are all, they're not equivalent to each other. That's probably not the way that probably not the right way to say that, rather, but they're like counterparts of each other, right? So if you want to flip between active and passive voice, you're really just switching out between these endings, okay? But like I said, the process is the same. So just like with active voice, to do present tense passive voice, you go to the infinitive, the second principal part of your verb, and you drop the RE. This gives you the present stem. Then you do any vowel flips that you normally would do with present tense, right? So in third conjugation, you're flipping the E to an I and then to a U. With third I and fourth, there's the whole IU deal. It's the same as active voice. The difference is you add your passive voice endings. That's the key difference. We don't use OST, must, sunt, right? And like I just said, you always want to make sure that you're taking account the vowel flips, but you also start with that first principal part, right? The first principal part of your verb is first person singular, present tense. That's active or passive voice. It doesn't matter. You still start there. All right. So sometimes the spelling is a little bit odd. So always start with that first principal part when you're trying to say I am doing something or I am being something, right? And again, pay attention to the vowel flips. That's an important thing to keep track of too. So let's take a look at some examples of how this works. If I gave you ambulo, ambulare, which means to walk, and I conjugated it in the passive voice, instead of ambulo, ambulas, ambulat, it would look slightly different. I'd still go to the infinitive, ambulare. I'd still drop the RE, so my stem is ambula, but I add my passive voice endings. That's the difference. But for the first answer, the first person singular, we start with ambulo, that first principal part, but I stick an R on it, right? So instead of ambulo, I have ambulor. It doesn't mean I walk, it means I am being walked. For the rest of them, I'm starting with ambula, which again is the infinitive without the RE, right? It's the present stem. But instead of st, mustus, unt, it's ristur, mur, mini, ntur. So ambularis means you are being walked, and ambulator means he, she, it is being walked, and ambulamur means we are being walked, and down the line, right? You can hear the different translation, the passive voice translation with am being something, right? Same thing for second conjugation. Take my first principal part, add an R, I get moveor, which means I am being moved. For the rest of them, I take the infinitive, movere, I drop the RE, which would give me a stem of move, moe, and I just add my passive voice ending. So moveris means you are being moved, movetor, he, she, it is being moved, and down the line, right? You just change your ending and you've got the passive voice. For third, you just want to pay attention to the vowel flips. The one thing that's a little different is in second person singular, where you'd expect an I, you actually still have an E. So to start from the beginning, you would take mito, right? Add an R, you get mitor, I am being sent. For the rest of them, with active voice, we're used to taking the infinitive, mitere, the second principal part, dropping the RE, that gives me a stem of mitte, and we usually flip the E to an I. We still do that here, except like I said, second person singular, it's going to stay in E. So instead of miteris, I-R-I-S, it's miteris with an E. Right? But I'm still using the same passive voice endings. I'm still flipping the E to an I for the rest of them. So I-T-U-R, I-M-U-R, I-M-I-N-I. There we go. And for the last one, we still make it a U, right? So me tuntor, they are being sent. For third IO and fourth, we're just following the same process, but with the I. So in other words, instead of, yako, it's yakio. That's what makes it a third IO verb. So you just make it yakior, I am being thrown. You still have in the second person, right, the E, but for the third person plural, it's I-U-N-T-U-R, right, yakiontor, they are being thrown. Otherwise, we're following the same process for active voice. We're just changing our endings, right, and that's what makes it passive. Same thing with a fourth conjugation verb, audio, audire. You can see it here. The one difference is with fourth conjugation, we're keeping it A-U-D-I for all of them, right? So if you look at that second person singular ending, audiris, there's no E there, right? Not that there would be, but for third and third I, you just want to keep track of that little vowel flip. But for fourth, it's very straightforward. You take audio, you add an R, and you have audior, I am being heard. For the rest of them, you take audire, the infinitive, you drop the RE, that gives you a stem of audi, A-U-D-I, and you just add your endings, right? The one difference is when you get to third person plural, they, it's I-U-N-T-U-R, audiuntor, they are being heard, okay? So hopefully this makes sense. I know it's kind of a quick review, but the process is the exact same thing as active voice. So you should feel pretty comfortable in knowing how to do this. You're really just changing the ending, right? That's the only difference, which is why a lot of times, a lot of textbooks will teach you active and passive voice at the exact same time. They kind of go together. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video that we use the ablative case with passive voice. So this is where you can get a little jargony, a little grammary, if that makes sense. But there is a different technical term depending on if the action in the passive voice verb is being done by a person or a thing. So if your verb is passive voice, right? I am thrown. I'm being thrown. If I was thrown by a person, we call that the ablative of agent. right? It goes with the preposition a or ab. So when a person is doing the action of a passive voice verb, you use the ablative case, but it goes with this preposition. If it's by a thing, we don't use a preposition. We call that the ablative of means. So it's the difference between saying, I am thrown by my brother, it means my brother picked me up and threw me, and I am hit by a shield or by a sword, right? A sword is a thing, so I wouldn't use the preposition to express that. This is what your textbook usually calls the ablative of agent or the ablative of means. The difference is basically who's doing the action of a passive voice verb. That's all it is. So let's look at a few examples so you can see this in action, right? A couple sentences that you can see the translation on. So if I gave you this sentence, interdum a magistro fabulae narantur, my verb is narantur, right? You can tell by the NTUR ending, it means they, right, are being told. The subject here is fabulae. So you're saying sometimes interdum, stories, fabulae, are being told by the teacher, a magistro. So a magistro is ablative case. That's telling you who did the telling. And it's got the a there because a magister, a teacher, is a person, right? So this is what we would call the ablative of agent, right? By the teacher. It's telling you who told the story. The stories, rather. But again, notice the passive voice translation. Stories are told. Now let's look at another one. Here we have Graiki sunt errati, itaque bellum parator. The Greeks are angry, Graiki sunt errati, and so war is prepared. Paratur, the TUR ending tells you it's passive voice, right? War is prepared. And here we don't even have an ablative because it doesn't really matter who's preparing war. We're just saying in general, war is being prepared. So this is a good example of when you use the passive voice because it doesn't really matter who's preparing war. The focus of the sentence is war is being prepared, right? Everyone's getting ready for war. Here we have another one. You have armati oneraris ad horas troianas mituntor. Here you have the soldiers, the armati, right? The armed people, you might say. Mituntor, they are sent or they are being sent, passive voice, to the shores of Troy, right? To the Trojan shores, rather, horas troianas, right? Then we have oneraris. There's the ablative by itself, no preposition. This is the ablative of means because an honorarius is a transport ship. So you're saying they are sent by transport ships, right? It's still telling you who did the action, but because it's a thing, we use what we call the ablative of means, right? There's no person involved, right? So we don't use the prepositional phrase. Again, this is what we call the ablative of means. Okay. Then we have the last one. You have Troia muro alto et portis firmis munitor, rather. Troy is defended or is being defended, munitor, right? It's a fourth conjugation verb, by a high wall, mura alto, et portis firmis, and by strong gates, right? Portis firmis. So here you have your passive voice verb, right? Troy is being defended, and you have the ablative of means. There's no person involved here. The thing defending the wall, defending Troy is the high wall, right? Muro alto, there's your ablative, and the strong gates, portis firmis. Right? So all of these are getting at the idea of like what a passive voice verb looks like, what it would look like in a sentence. And the real trick here is you're going to notice right away the ending is really what gives it away. Once you get used to the passive voice endings, they kind of stick out at you as being different from what you're used to. And that's how you can tell between active and passive voice, right? In the present tense, it's really just a change in the ending. So a pro tip to practice all this, if you want more practice, go to Magistrula, right? It'll be your best friend. You can hop on Magistrula. Again, I don't own Magistrula, just a big fan, but you can hop on and set it to only give you passive voice verbs, which would be very useful for practice. So get on there. If you want to practice conjugating them, you can do that. If you want to do sentences, you can do that. Either way, you can set it to just deal with passive voice, present tense verbs. It would be a major help to you. So let's recap everything we just did. Okay. Again, the passive voice is when the subject is receiving the action, not doing anything. We translate it as being blank, right? I am being blank. You are, he, she, it is being, whatever, being seen, heard, whatever. Use the past tense form of your verb. And it's formed the same way as the active voice. You just use the passive endings. So everything you've learned about how to form present tense active voice, you still do it. You just change the endings. And that's really the trick, right? Once you get used to it, you'll be okay. The real trick, like I said, is practicing. The more you can read Latin with passive voice verbs in it, the more you do on Magistrula, things like that, practice problems in your textbook, whatever you're using, the more you do, the better off you're going to feel about it, and you'll get used to it pretty quickly. If you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'll be happy to help you. But otherwise, just keep at it. And like I said, the more you practice, the better off you'll be.